The weight of my grief finally lifted. Starting today, my parents were moving in with me. After my parents passed away, Stephen, my husband, had demolished our family home. Standing in front of the rubble, he shouted at me, "Hurry up and bring the inheritance to our place." "What are you talking about? Have you lost your mind?" I asked, stunned. My words were met with a bewildered silence from Stephen and his parents. It was then I decided to tell them the truth. My name is Lisa Jackson. I was born the eldest daughter to ordinary office worker parents. I have one brother, and we were just a normal family. I married Stephen when I was 29, and we had 2 children. Balancing work and parenting, I suddenly found myself at 52, my son, Daniel, and daughter, Sarah, grown up, each living on their own and starting their careers. Now it was time to relax with my husband. It was an ordinary life, but I was happy. I thought I would continue to age like this, but my simple life changed one winter day. My father was in a car accident and passed away suddenly. He was only 68. Our family was overwhelmed with grief, especially my mother, who was so depressed she couldn't even eat. "Mom, I know it's hard, but you need to eat," I told her over and over. "I know," she replied, "but I just don't have the appetite. It feels like there's something stuck in my chest." My brother and I thought she was just emotionally distressed, so we kept an eye on her. However, she lost weight rapidly. In just 3 weeks, worried, I took her to the hospital. The diagnosis was shocking: cancer. It was advanced, and surgery wasn't an option. She had about a year left to live. I hadn't had the chance to take care of my parents properly yet. Losing my father was hard enough, but now my mother was facing this illness. I was even more devastated, but I couldn't grieve forever. My brother lived far away and couldn't help, so it was up to me to take care of my mother. I told Stephen that I wanted to live with my mother. I couldn't leave her alone, both emotionally and physically, during her illness. Stephen's reaction surprised me. "We just finished dealing with your dad's funeral, and now I have to be dragged into more of your family's issues," he said, clearly annoyed. "You don't have to say it like that," I replied. "Can't you just drive her to the hospital and back? Do we have to live with her?" "I think she might feel lonely if it's not okay. Maybe I can just stay at my family home for a while," I suggested. Stephen became indignant. "Who's going to take care of my meals while you're gone?" "I'll come and cook, of course," I said. "What about cleaning? Who's going to do the laundry?" he demanded. I fell silent. I intended to do what I could, but I couldn't handle everything as before. Confronted with this reality hurt. If someone said I was being selfish for wanting to care for my mother, I wouldn't be able to argue back. I was sure my mother would say everything was fine as it was, but I wanted to do something for my parents. "Fine, but I'm not helping with anything," Stephen said grudgingly. His attitude was arrogant, but he had ultimately agreed. "I'm sorry and thank you," I said. Although I thought he was being awful, he had agreed to my wish. I suppressed my desire to argue and thanked him despite the trouble. Stephen and I started living with my mother at my family home. We had originally been living in a house provided by Stephen's employer. Stephen was an only child, and his father wanted us to live together, so we hadn't planned on buying our own home. We were going to move in with Stephen's parents eventually. Living in the company housing was more convenient for work, and the rent was only about $11,000 a month, so it wasn't a big burden. But now that we've moved to my family home, we don't have to pay that rent anymore, and we have more space. I think living together wasn't all bad for Stephen. True to his word, Stephen didn't help with anything, but I was glad I could live with my mother. She seemed energetic, but often felt weak and spent a lot of time lying down during the day. I prepared her meals, fed her, and managed her medication. It would have been impossible for her to do all that alone. "I'm sorry, Amy." "Thank you. It's a big help that you're here with me." "I should thank Stephen too," my mother said, expressing her gratitude. She wasn't aware of the harsh words Stephen had said about living together, so she was grateful to him as well. One evening, after my mother had gone to bed and Stephen returned home, I brought up the subject of my mother's treatment while serving dinner. Stephen glared at me and said, "I don't know what you want me to say. I told you I'm not helping with anything." He refused even to listen. I needed someone to vent to, someone to consult. All I wanted was for Stephen to listen. Even after 2 months and then 3 months, Stephen's attitude didn't change. He constantly complained about living together, acting as if he was doing me a huge favor. His behavior grew more obnoxious each day, but I couldn't say anything against it. Between worrying about my mother and trying to be considerate of Stephen, I was becoming increasingly stressed. As the 2-year prognosis approached, my mother's condition worsened rapidly. She was hospitalized, and just 5 days later, she passed away. Although I had mentally prepared myself, I was still devastated. My brother's family and my children arrived right away and were a big help, but during times like these, you want your spouse by your side. Instead, Stephen was laughing and chatting with his parents in a corner, not helping with any of the funeral preparations. My brother took the lead in organizing everything, and somehow we managed to get everything ready for the funeral. Stephen, who should have been sitting in the family section, was at the back with the relatives. "Stephen, I want you to sit in the family section," I told him. He replied, "No, I'm fine here. I'm not a blood relative after all." "But you're my husband," I said. Then his mother chimed in, "He's your husband, but he's not your mother's son. Stephen is our son, so he's an outsider. Lisa should sit in the family section." Hearing this from my in-laws was painful. I was left speechless. In my culture, it's common for sons-in-law to sit in the family section at funerals, though I know it might differ by region. With Stephen not sitting in the family section, distant relatives started whispering, wondering if we had divorced. It was one thing for people to gossip, but all of this could have been avoided if Stephen had just sat where he was supposed to. Feeling a bit upset that Stephen wasn't by my side, we still managed to see my mother off peacefully. After the funeral, my brother's family, my children, Stephen, and his parents returned to my family home. "Thank you for coming, especially at such a busy time," I said to my in-laws, offering them some tea. They laughed and replied, "Really, it's something. First your father, now your mother. These funeral expenses are a burden for us too, but at least that's the end of it." I was stunned by their words. What did they mean by that? I couldn't believe they would say such a thing. I forced a smile and excused myself. Then I overheard Stephen talking with his parents. "It must have been tough for you, Stephen, living without outsiders," his mother said. "Yeah, dealing with Amy's whims was a pain. A husband shouldn't just follow his wife's demands. If you don't like something, you have every right to refuse," Stephen said. I clenched my fists. Their voices, laughing and chatting, were unbearable, but this wasn't new. Stephen's parents had always been insensitive and rude. When Stephen and I got married, his mother had said, "Couldn't you find someone more attractive? I can't expect much for grandchildren." His father had joked, "They say beauty gets boring after 3 days. With Amy, you won't get bored." And Stephen had just laughed. Looking back, neither Stephen nor his parents had ever offered a comforting word, either at my father's funeral or after my mother's passing. Instead, they ridiculed me. I had felt sorry for imposing on Stephen, but now I questioned his behavior. I had been too concerned about Stephen while just wanting to do right by my mother. I realized I shouldn't have felt so guilty towards Stephen, especially since he wasn't supportive. I was simmering with anger while Stephen and his parents continued to laugh and chat in another room. If my brother's family and my kids had heard them, they would have been upset, but fortunately, they were in the kitchen. I was relieved to be the only one who heard Stephen and his parents' conversation. Then my mother-in-law spoke up. "Amy," she called. "Yes," I replied, startled. "Can I have this?" she asked, holding up my mother's purse. Confused, I stammered, "Oh, well, your mother won't be needing it anymore, right?" Stephen suggested I take it home. "Home," she said. "Maybe I'll just keep it." As she inspected the purse, I couldn't believe her audacity, especially right after the funeral. I took the purse from her and said firmly, "No, you can't." Her expression changed, not because of the purse, but because I, her daughter-in-law, stood up to her. I stood my ground. "We're not ready to sort through my mother's belongings yet. We'll distribute her keepsakes among the family later." My mother-in-law turned red with anger. "What do you mean? Are you saying I'm an outsider?" You said earlier at the funeral that even Stephen was an outsider to my mother. How come Stephen is an outsider, but your family isn't? I retorted. You said at the funeral that even Stephen was an outsider to my mother. How come Stephen is an outsider, but your family isn't? Hearing this, Stephen and his father also turned red. What are you saying? Apologize to Mom. How disrespectful of a daughter-in-law to talk like that, they said. Their commotion drew everyone from the other room. I didn't expect to be called an outsider after all the effort we put into attending the funeral. Let's go home, Dad. My mother-in-law shouted at me in front of everyone and stormed out of the house. For some reason, even Stephen was angry and left with his parents. What happened? Did you call your mother-in-law an outsider? Everyone asked me, having only heard her side of the story. Taken out of context, it might have seemed like I was the one being harsh, but I explained the situation to everyone, and not a single person blamed me. My children said, Grandpa and Grandma should be more considerate of other people's feelings. That's just how Dad, Grandma, and Grandpa have always been. Although my children sided with me, I still couldn't forgive those three. Stephen hadn't come home for a while since that day, and I hadn't contacted him either. I didn't think I should be the one to apologize, and I wasn't sure if I could forgive him even if he did, but I knew things couldn't stay this way forever. One day, Stephen came back home. I greeted him, trying to suppress the anger that flared up when I saw him. It's been tough, huh? He said, his gruff tone and attempt at showing concern taking me aback. Take the kids and go on a trip. It'll be a good change of scenery for you, he said, handing me travel vouchers. I was speechless. Tears started streaming down my face. It might have been the kids' idea, but I was touched that Stephen had gone along with it. I immediately contacted the kids to plan the trip. Dad suggested this? I asked, surprised. It's surprising, isn't it? The kids said, astonished by the proposal. It seemed like Stephen was trying to make amends. I wondered if he felt guilty about what had happened. I'll be off then, I said gratefully, accepting the travel vouchers from Stephen. Yeah, take your time. Stay with the kids at their places too, why not? Stephen said. I can't be away that long, I replied. Don't worry about me. I'll relax at my parents'. Just enjoy yourself, Stephen said as he sent me off. Sarah was happy to have me visit, so before heading to the spa, I stopped by her place and then Gary's. I hadn't been able to visit them while I was caring for my mother, so I helped out by cooking and freezing meals for them. Mom, you should relax, but thanks, this helps, they both said, delighted to have my cooking at home. This opportunity was all thanks to Stephen's suggestion. Then came the eagerly awaited spa trip. I spent a relaxing time at the hot springs with my children. The weariness from caregiving and the sorrow of losing my parents seemed to ease quite a bit. I was away for almost a week, but both my kids returned to their homes with bright smiles. That was fun. We should thank Dad for once, they said. True, just this once, but I wonder if he's up to something, Sarah joked. Don't say that. Dad thought about us in his way, I laughed. When I returned home, ready to share my trip memories with Stephen and start anew as a couple, I was shocked. The house was gone. I looked around in disbelief. Although I recognized the location, the family home that should have been there was demolished. Suddenly, Stephen appeared, followed by his parents. They were grinning at me while I stood there dumbfounded. Stephen, what's going on? I asked, trying to stay calm. Stephen, with a sickening smile, said, Finally, I'm rid of that baggage. Starting today, my parents are moving in with me at my house. What are you talking about? I replied, trying to keep my composure. Have you lost your mind? Your family home has been demolished. Bring the inheritance to her place quickly. Whatever you inherited, it's Stephen's now, Stephen said. I realized then that the disappearance of the house was Stephen's doing, all for the inheritance. The betrayal was overwhelming. As I drove home, I was filled with indescribable sadness and anger, but I wasn't going to let Stephen get away with this. I burst into laughter at their smirking faces. My laughter baffled Stephen and his father. Why are you laughing? What a weird woman. Has she gone crazy? My mother-in-law said, looking at me as if I were eerie. Facing them, I said, Don't you guys know what you're talking about? I haven't inherited a single penny, so there's no inheritance. I burst into laughter again. They had mistakenly thought they'd become rich from the inheritance. Their wild imaginations and actions made me laugh uncontrollably. What do you mean? Explain yourself, Stephen demanded. But I kept my mouth shut. I didn't feel the need to enlighten them. I'm not going to live with strangers. If you want to live together, go ahead alone, I said, ignoring Stephen's question and rejecting his suggestion. My mother-in-law was furious. You helped with your parents' housework, but you can't do ours? You're aware of the circumstances, right? I agreed to live together, didn't I? She yelled. I told you I didn't want to live together, I refuted. You chose to live together to avoid housework. Also, demolishing the family home like that, there are things you just shouldn't do. I yelled at them and then left. Where are you going? Stephen's voice called out, but I didn't look back. I needed to find a place to stay for the night and didn't want to see Stephen's face. I immediately consulted a lawyer. Demolishing a house couldn't be that easy. The house was still in my mother's name. I wondered which company had done it. Then an unbelievable truth came to light. Stephen and his father had demolished it themselves. His father, who worked in demolition, had enlisted the help of acquaintances and rented heavy machinery. The planning was meticulous. They had even given me travel vouchers to get rid of me. Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized I had been deceived. The frustration was unbearable. I asked the lawyer if there was any way to punish all three of them. The lawyer smiled kindly. Stephen unlawfully demolished the house in your mother's name. He could be charged with property destruction and held liable for the damage. Let's start by demanding a formal apology from Stephen and his parents. I nodded in agreement, and the lawyer quickly took the necessary actions. A few days later, Stephen called me, furious about the legal notice he received. What's with this certified letter? He yelled. Oh, you got it. You destroyed my precious house, so of course, you have to compensate, I replied. Compensate? We said we were moving to my parents' place, Stephen said. I demolished a house that nobody was going to live in. You should be thanking me, not asking for compensation. Now bring the inheritance and come back home, Stephen said arrogantly. Thank you for demolishing my house. Don't make me laugh. And what inheritance? It's not even settled yet. I shouted back. Stephen was silent, seemingly taken aback by my rare display of anger. The reason I laughed when the house was demolished was exactly this. I had spent a whole year with my mother, and it was clear we would discuss the inheritance. I told my brother I didn't want anything and that he should get it all. As a result, he inherited all the cash and stocks. He insisted I should have the house since he lived far away and couldn't manage it. If I wasn't going to live there, it could be rented out. That was the plan. Either you and your father restore the house to its original state or pay the amount specified in the letter, I said. I'm considering settling this amicably. If you can't pay, I'll file a police report and see you in court. I'm sorry. I didn't think you'd get so angry, Stephen said, starting to make excuses. Of course, I'm angry. What did you expect? I snapped. Stephen seemed to think that if my family home was gone, he wouldn't have to live with his parents. His father had always wanted to live together and had a fondness for Daniel. Stephen had previously refused to live together, citing long commutes. His parents thought I was the one against it, so he convinced them by demolishing my house and making it seem like I'd move in with them for the inheritance. But I couldn't forgive him after hearing such a thing. Please give me a break. I didn't mean any harm, Stephen said. Sorry, too. If he's truly sorry, then agree to the settlement, I said and hung up the phone. Stephen kept calling and sending messages apologizing. If you're sorry, just transfer the money, I told him, pushing him away. I knew my childhood home couldn't be restored, but this was the only way I could deal with my unbearable feelings. I stayed at Sarah's place. My brother's family and my children knew about the situation. Although my brother must have been angry about our house being demolished without his consent, he said, I won't interfere, but I'll help in any way I can. Do what you think is best, Amy. Everyone condemned Stephen's actions and supported me. A month passed without any compensation or payment from Stephen. During that time, there was no contact with him. I couldn't stay with Sarah forever. I wanted to get the money as soon as possible to at least establish a living foundation. Contrary to my wishes, something unbelievable happened. Sarah revealed, "This apron looks a lot like Grandma's," showing me her smartphone screen. I was surprised when I saw it. It was a listing on a flea market app. The apron Sarah mentioned, similar to my mother's, was a unique one I had made for her. "This is Grandma's apron." "I made it, so I'm sure," I said. Sarah quickly checked other listings. The sellers seemed to have recently joined the app with no transactions or reviews yet. There were nearly 50 items listed, and to my horror, all of them belonged to my mother. I immediately realized it was Stephen. He was the only one who could have taken my mother's belongings after demolishing the house. I called Stephen right away. "What's this about the app?" I asked. Stephen responded, sounding annoyed. "What app? Don't play dumb. You're selling Mom's things without permission, aren't you? Cancel those listings right now," I demanded. Stephen, sounding panicked, replied, "What? No, it wasn't me. Who else would do such a thing?" "I'm coming over right now to get everything back," I said and hung up. I immediately headed to Stephen's parents' house with Sarah. "Where are Mom's things?" I demanded as soon as we arrived, confronting Stephen at the door. "I don't know anything about it," he stuttered. "Tell the truth, Dad." Sarah joined me in pressuring Stephen. He seemed flustered. Stephen's parents noticed our presence and came out. "Oh, Sarah, you're here," Stephen's mom greeted, smiling at the sight of her granddaughter. Angry, Sarah said, "Grandma, tell Dad to tell the truth. Grandma's belongings, that passed away recently, Dad seems to be selling them at." Sarah's words made Stephen's mom burst into laughter. Stephen, with a troubled look, kept repeating, "It wasn't me." His mother then loudly exclaimed, "Stephen is selling them? That's impossible. I am the one selling them." I felt my blood run cold. Stephen probably knew about it with a look that almost said, "This is bad." He turned to his mother. Despite Sarah's shock, Stephen's mother cheerfully continued, "What? It's a lot of work, you know. I have to pack everything carefully and make sure the photos look good." She seemed oblivious to the fact that she was selling stolen goods, chatting happily about the app. I struggled to restrain myself from lunging at her. "Cancel the listings. Those are yours to sell," Sarah read with anger and tears in her eyes, pleading with her grandmother. However, Stephen's mother seemed displeased. "What's the big deal? I finally found a hobby I enjoy. I use the things I can and sell the rest for a little pocket money. It's good for preventing dementia. I'm the only grandma left, so Sarah wants me to stay healthy and live long, right?" she said nonchalantly. Pleading with her to stop had no effect. There was no sign of remorse. If talking wouldn't help, then action was the only option. "Sarah, let's go." "It's okay. Let's just go," I assisted, pulling Sarah out of the house and heading straight to the police station. I wasn't planning to file a report for the demolition of the house, but the theft was a different story. When I explained to the police that my mother's belongings were being stolen and sold, they acted immediately. They suspended Stephen's mother's account on the flea market app so the items wouldn't be sold anymore. On the way back from the station, I called Stephen. "I had your mother's account stopped. You knew about it, right? You're complicit." "No, I filed a police report about this. Please cooperate with the investigation," Stephen replied, sounding frantic. "What? We're family, right?" "Withdraw it, please," Stephen pleaded. "Family? You still haven't paid any compensation for the house or alimony, and there's no sign of remorse," I shouted. Stephen looked taken aback by my anger. Despite everything, I still had feelings for him after living with him for so long. I sighed and said, "I'll wait for the money, but I won't forgive the theft. Return everything, and Stephen, your father looked quite unwell. Has he seen a doctor?" "What?" "I'm not a monster," Stephen said, his voice defensive. "I'm just passing on the message." I hung up the phone. Stephen's father, whom I had just seen, was alarmingly thin and hadn't spoken much. His complexion was not just pale but unnaturally dark. His ill health was obvious, but his family probably had noticed. His wife was nonchalant about selling stolen items, and Stephen only acted tough with me. They seemed to lack real concern for others. The next day, I received a call from Stephen's father. I expected a thank you call but got the complete opposite. What do you mean by treating me like a sick person? Planning to dump me in a hospital to get rid of the hassle? I need to protect Stephen and my wife from you. I'm not going to any hospital, he scolded. It was shocking to be reprimanded when I was just concerned. Sorry for overstepping. I was just worried, I said. I'm not frail or short-lived like your parents. Don't make a fool of me, he snapped. I was infuriated by his words, but a few days later, he felt unwell enough to visit the hospital. The diagnosis was terminal cancer. Stephen called me in a panic. Dad's got terminal cancer. What am I going to do? I just snorted. I don't know. What did he say when you suggested going to the hospital? He said, I'm not frail or short-lived like your parents, so deal with it yourself. How can you be so heartless, Amy? I never thought you'd be such a person. Did you ever say a single warm word when my mother was sick? Reflect on your actions, I said, and hung up. As expected, Stephen's father passed away soon after. As a human being, I didn't want to harbor negative feelings towards the deceased, but recalling everything that had been done and said, I couldn't shed a tear after his funeral. His will was found. Despite all the talk of not being short-lived, he had made thorough preparations. The house was to go to the grandson, Daniel, and the rest of the estate was to be divided between his wife and eldest son. I was surprised to see Daniel's name. Stephen's father had always favored him, wanting to live with him. He must have wanted Daniel to have the house even after his death. It was a new nuisance for Daniel. Renounce the inheritance. You don't need that house, do you? I told Daniel, but he was happy to receive it. Inheriting the house was more of a burden due to inheritance tax, but if he was pleased, I had no right to say anything. Following the will, Daniel inherited the house. His grandmother was happy and paid the inheritance tax. He's our successor after all, she said. While that was true, I felt a bit sad, as if Daniel had been taken from me. Then something unbelievable happened. Stephen called. Come over to our house. I headed straight to his parents' house. When I arrived, I saw Stephen's mother and Stephen standing in front of their house, stunned, just as I once had been. The site was filled with heavy machinery and trucks labeled with demolition company names. Workers were tearing down their houses right before our eyes. What's going on? It's my house. I can do what I want with it, Daniel said, appearing from somewhere, looking satisfied as he watched the demolition. Daniel, what are you doing? Stop this right now, Stephen shouted. Stopping it now won't make it livable anyway, Daniel replied. What have you done? Stephen's mother and Stephen begged Daniel, but Daniel just left. Did you forget what Grandpa and Dad did to Mom, Grandma? You were awful to Mom too, right? Did you apologize? Daniel's smile turned into a sharp glare at Stephen's mother and Stephen. They fell to their knees as the heavy machinery continued to noisily dismantle their house. I finally felt relieved seeing the scene. Later, Stephen finally paid the damages and compensation from the inherited assets. The stolen items that Stephen's mother had taken from my mother were retrieved by Daniel and safely returned to me. You always have me and Sarah, Daniel said, and I finally shed tears of relief. Stephen and his mother, having lost their house and left with no money, were now living in a company house again. Stephen and I had moved out of the company house, but now Stephen and his mother had to return, becoming the subject of rumors. I explained the whole truth to Stephen's colleague's wife, with whom we were on good terms. Stephen and his mother would likely have a hard life in the company housing, but it was their own doing. After Stephen's retirement, they'd be forced to save up for a new place to live. I sometimes think about asking my friend how Stephen and his mother are living now, just to have something to talk about. After that, I continued to stay at Sarah's house. Then Daniel got engaged to be married and planned to build a house. The land of the former family home sold for a decent amount, and I was glad to see that even that house served a purpose. Mom, come live with us, Daniel offered. His fiancée welcomed me warmly. Since I couldn't keep relying on Sarah, who lived alone indefinitely, I decided to take Daniel up on his offer. I am thinking of living happily with my new family, determined not to become a mother-in-law like my own mother-in-law.